everyone. Welcome, welcome. There are a few more people I saw walking up the stairs. Can the panelists just sit on their panelist chairs one time? Yes, come with your wine, we don't judge. Secretly. Actually, can I just tell you guys? So I went to fetch the wine. Yes, I went to fetch the wine last night from a wonderful Jenny Detoli who donated the wine. But then I had a car full of teenagers later on in the evening that I had to take the Imam Zamaye to. And there was no space in my car, so there's now I'm 13-year-olds asking 13-year-olds to put wine on their laps. I was like, this is not who I want to be as a person, but okay. It's a little joke. Guys, please have a seat. Let's have a seat. Sorry. Thank you. Okay. I'm just going to give, I know that there was one more today. Welcome, welcome. Please don't be shy. Come sit in the front. I'll sit in the front. Okay. To the people online, we are starting now. Sorry that you are not with the wine and soup. The benefits of living in Cape Town, right? That and a few other things. The mountain. I'm talking about the mountain. Okay, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Black Sash Khuluma entitled, So We Voted Now What? A Post-Election Analysis. This was an important conversation we needed to have from the beginning of May already. From the beginning of May already, yeah, before. And that was given... That was given that the last few months in the run-up to elections saw a lot of divisive rhetoric, campaigning based on overturning hard-fought constitutional gains, and a testing of the political legislation through several court cases, MK1, MK2, MK3, Dali Argument 1, Dali Argument 2, so there's lots of court cases. And then there were lots of sentiments about bringing back the death penalty, banning sex education in schools, and mass deportation of foreign nationals became increasingly popular. And that's why we felt we needed to have a discussion about, after all of this rhetoric, what is next. And so following election day, the last 2 weeks have been what can only be described as unprecedented times. Euphemism emphasized. And so an anecdotal research showed that 1 out of 4 people in South Africa voted along nationalistic lines, i.e. they voted because they were colored, Zulu or white, and so was the candidate. And so the 2024 general elections also marked 30 years since our democracy and was our 6th election. And we woke up on 30th of May to a new balance of power nationally and in several provinces, including KZN. The result of the 2024 elections could not have been predicted. Many people were shocked at the declining majority of the ANC, but many more accepted that this election, despite its many hiccups, was free and fair. The IEC and many election observers have said that despite the many 4-hour-long, 6-hour-long, 8-hour-long hiccups, that the elections were free and fair, and Black Sash accepts that and welcomes the 7th Parliament. But what will the 7th Parliament look like? And what will it mean for state institutions, for ordinary people, for young people especially? And this is why we are here tonight with our highly qualified panelists, which will guide the conversation. So we want to welcome everyone here. And we want to welcome, the reason we wanted food beforehand, sorry to those online, is because we want to feel like this is a dinner conversation. I had a few friends over last week. We had some soup and some food, and we discussed it in our home. And so I want that to feel like this evening. So your inputs will be welcome, obviously within the spirit and purpose of the Constitution, or else I will remove you. Not joking. So in these unprecedented times, again, euphemism included, and despite the confusion, anxiety, and excitement, this is a catalyst, and so we welcome you, and thank you for being here this evening. So I want to quickly, and I don't know why I was standing in front of them, it's very rude of me. I just wanted to introduce you to our panelists and our moderator. So I'm going to say the modest and the unmodest over there, because these two sent two-line bios, and these ones sent paragraphs. So Barbara, who is a Mitchell's Plain native and wants us to, and so yay for that, is the deputy editor of Ground Up and has worked in media for the last 10 years. So thank you, Barbara, for moderating this evening. And then William Shoki, who I made send a second version of his bio, is the editor of Africa is a Country and has written for numerous outlets, including the New York Times, Jacobin, Al Jazeera, and Verso. He also serves on the editorial board of Amandla magazine. Thank you, William. And then Kaya, okay, let me go to Pearl first, sorry. Pearl is the managing director of Youth Lab. She holds a master's degree in political studies from Wits University with a focus on youth participation in policy making and is currently a PhD candidate in this field. During her student years, she was involved in organizations. She was involved in organizations like Amnesty International, don't be shy, where she served as the chairperson of the Wits branch and was elected to the Student Representative Council in 2023. So her own bit of politics. I saw some 2013, sorry. In 2001, sorry, it's been a long, I could not serve on the IEC because I'm not good with numbers. In 2021, Pearl was appointed as a board member of the National Youth Development Agency by President Cyril Ramaphosa. In the same year, she was appointed by the President to serve on the National Planning Commission as the National Planning Commissioner responsible for youth development. And then most recently, she serves on the board of WESA, which is Wildlife and Environmental Society of South Africa. So welcome, Pearl. And then Kaya Sitole, who I'm sure you've all seen on our TVs before, is a chartered accountant, academic and activist, a radio broadcaster, and a financial writer. He currently serves as a board member of the Black Securities and Investment Professionals and responsible for advocacy and regulatory affairs. He also serves on the board with me of My Vote Counts, yay for My Vote Counts, and on the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. He has many qualifications, including in 2019 completing his postgraduate studies at the said Business School at the University of Oxford, and he's also awarded the Atlantic Fellowship for Racial Equality by Columbia University and the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So with that, thank you and welcome. And now I will sit down and maybe grab a snack, but hand it over to Barbara.
Thank you. I think we can, I might have something on. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you. So thank you, Amanda, for setting the scene for us. So on the 29th of May, some of us on the 26th, the 27th and the 28th went to the polls to vote. I think some of us didn't realize what a watershed moment this would actually be for our country. Some of us were aware of this, but I thought it would be amped for us to just set the scene before we go to discuss among our panelists on what we can expect. I think, can Kaya just walk us through what can we take from past elections, past results? Thank you, Kaya.
Good evening to everyone. So I think obviously the question of what happens next is a simple one. You get to live with the consequences of what you did on the 29th of May as citizens. So it was obviously a remarkably shocking result in the sense that people knew that we had declined in the ANC. Very few people could map out how huge the decline was going to be. And also the rise of the MK party within a 6-month period is completely unprecedented. So obviously a lot of us were like, whoa, actually this was much steeper than what we thought it was going to be. So now that we're here, we need to try and figure out how the country is going to function the day after tomorrow, or if it's going to function at all. So obviously tomorrow is the big day, and what we'll see is the net result of what's been going on over the past couple of weeks, the trade-offs and however people have sold their souls to the devil and whatever the case might be. Then we'll start seeing the manifestation of that in the voting patterns that we're going to see tomorrow. And then obviously after tomorrow, I think it's the more difficult part of then trying to figure out how all these completely divergent viewpoints and divergent political ideologies can work together towards a common purpose. And I think what is obviously the key question is, can you even formulate a common manifesto for a country for the next 5 years and say this is what needs to be done and how this is going to be done and who's going to do it? It's going to be remarkably difficult. So earlier on today, I was not on TV, I was in front of I was on a newspaper cover. If people still buy newspapers, Yeah, my face is there on the front. So I wrote an opinion on Business Day, which is to say that one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face is how to recover from the accountability vacuum that you've had for many years. And what that accountability vacuum was really the fact that, for a 30-year period, I could be an ANC minister, and I'm going to go and be held accountable by people who revere who I am because I'm senior in the party and all of that stuff. So it really weakened that accountability mechanism, and I think there were very few instances of very strong pushback from Parliament on what were really some really tame reports that were coming from the executive. So obviously now that the ANC is no longer guaranteed that essentially that veto power on every single portfolio committee, for example, we're hoping that it makes for a more robust and a more accountable system. So that's the first hope that you're going to have. And then obviously the second question is, a lot of people are speculating that, in a government of national unity or this grand coalition, then I'll be the president, you'll be the speaker, you'll be a minister, you'll be an MEC. The problem with that is that people tend to underestimate how intersectional government is, right? So let's use Gaten McKenzie, for example, because I think is very prominent on this side of the world. If you gave him what he wants, you need to get him to understand that he actually depends on the benevolence of others in order to execute on what he wants. So if you say, for example, that you want to run the transport portfolio because you want to fix Transnet or something like that, well, Transnet is not, the transport portfolio depends on it surviving the resource contestation that happens with other departments, for example. So if you know that, I need 10 trains in order to do this, there's no guarantee that you're going to get enough resources to get the 10 trains moving. So what that creates is a simple question of, when people put up their hands and they say, we want this ministry, do they actually understand that unless everybody else works together, you could actually be sabotaged from day one, in the sense that you won't have the resources that are necessary, and the complementary ministries that need to work with you and work alongside you, if they don't buy into that, then you might have a problem. So the net result of this is that 6.5 years after he came into power, Cyril Ramaphosa is now expected to actually be in power, because all along he's been the reluctant mediator and the placator of these different formations within his own political party. Now, obviously, when there's so many more people involved in decision making, somebody has to make a decision, and that's something that hasn't happened for a very long time. Whether he's got the capacity to do so or the willingness to do so, that's what the next 5 years are going to be about. And of course, if he doesn't, then it's probably not a 5-year conversation after all. Okay.
And I think that's a great segue for us to get into maybe analyze if you have we didn't see as much youth showing up to the polls this year, though we saw a significant amount of students voting. Pearl, I wonder if you could just speak a little to about the vote, how students voted. We don't necessarily have the stats yet from the ISC, but if you could just speak to how the youth voted this round.
I was going to say,
I think he was listening.
Oh, he was listening.
Yeah.
going to see me at the office on Monday, and he's like, what are you saying about me? I think he's cool.
There you go.
This is sabotage. I just want to point that out. This is clearly sabotage. Yeah, no, then everyone's going to hear me. Hi, everybody. So I think the one thing to say is everybody didn't turn up to vote, right? Not just young people. We've had the lowest voter turnout since '94, and the last time we said that was at the last election. And so we've had an even lower voter turnout this year. And it was a really weird kind of experience because you walked around looking at the queues. I foolishly took a bet where I said this voter turnout is going to knock 2019 out the park. And I said it's even going to knock 2014 out the park. And so now I'm 200 Rand poorer. But people didn't show up to vote, right? And when people did show up to vote, the inability of the IEC to deliver an efficient election was really, really made things really, really difficult, right? So lots of people got turned away. The deal with teachers, SATU teachers not being not working in voting stations anymore really, I think, crippled the IEC, right? So I know I went to my voting station. I thought I was going to be like the one clever Sally who would get there at 7 o'clock in the morning and I'd be first, right? Because I am young, so I don't like standing in queues. And I was like, I'm gonna get there at 7. Like, it's gonna be fine. I'm gonna vote first and then it's gonna be good. And I got there to find the presiding officer going, "We have 2 minutes." And I said, oh no. So I was like, okay, lady, let me tell you why you have 3 minutes. Give me one of those. But like, and so we had IEC officials who weren't properly informed of the process, and so they couldn't adequately answer people's questions. And then you also had an incredibly low voter education, right? And I think every election we see the extent of like the depths of the pit we are in when we look at voter education, right? And it's not just young people, it's across the board, right? People are just uninformed, but a lot of people don't make the effort to be informed, right? So if you're talking about people who are really disadvantaged and really don't have access, and you're saying they're uninformed, that makes sense. You can't tell me someone who works for Coca-Cola, and I know this because she was wearing like a Coca-Cola jacket in the voting line, and she was like, I didn't register for this election, and I'm still registered to vote in Durban, but like, can I just vote here? And I was like, this auntie has a corporate job, right? And so across the board, we have incredibly low voter education. We have an IEC that does not have the financial muscle contrary to spicy statements from Treasury about the money that they did or did not give them. Do you have an IEC that well, and people who don't feel like this democracy serves them, right? I work for an organization called Youth Lab, and we run this project in elections called the Manifesto. A lot in this conversation, but what we do is we go across the country, and our lead question is, if the youth of South Africa had to write their own election manifesto, what does that look like? And so we ran this project ahead of the 2019 election, and we've now done it for this one. And we ask questions like, do you understand what proportional representation is? Will you be voting in this election? Would you prefer to vote for a party rather than a person? One of the biggest questions I ask people is, do you think that elections can change things in your communities? And by and large, an overwhelming majority of young people say no, right? And so how do you interact with a democracy that is so far from you, right? You don't see things changing in your communities. All the politicians sound the same, really. They just wear different T-shirts. And so largely, young people continue to be excluded, right? So one of the things I like to do in my spare time, because I clearly hate my life, is I read all the election manifestos, and then I summarize them for people on Twitter, because I live on Twitter with Kaya. And if you, in this election, wanted to vote for a presidential candidate or a party leader who was youth, and by youth, I mean under 35, not ANC Youth League youth ages. If you wanted to vote for a presidential candidate under the 35, we had 52 parties on the national ballot. You had 0 options, right? If you wanted to vote for a woman, I think in this one we did better. We had like 7. In 2019, we had 4. And so you can't see yourself in this democracy, right? And then you ask people to show up to vote. And the last point that I'll make, because Gretchen threatened to throw a shoe at me, is the question of, what are we voting for, right? Why are we voting? And we've seen in this election, the big identity politics conversation has come up, and it's always interesting to see who the identity politics fall to, right? So we've said ethno-nationalism because the MK has gotten a lot of votes, but we don't ever call it that when we look at all the DA votes, right? As if people who vote for the DA aren't voting because they're white, right? We vote on single issues, right? So we're not necessarily voting on the caliber of leader. We're voting because Gayton McKenzie said we're gonna build a wall and keep all the foreigners out. He really did say that in his manifesto, I'm not even joking. You're voting for the ACDP because they said we're going to remove comprehensive sex education at schools, right? Or you're voting for the DA because they said we're going to scrap minimum wage, and you're like, yeah, I don't think people should be paid. So we vote based on singular issues, and what we're seeing increasingly is the kind of issues that stir people up to vote are against the values that we've decided we espouse as a nation. Right? So why is it that it's so much easier to mobilize people towards more right-wing politics and anti-human rights positions? Why is it so difficult to mobilize people around, well, we would like to give you free education? And I think the interesting thing is maybe looking at the EFF story, right? Where the EFF has always been the people that talked about land. And they were able to mobilize so strongly about land. And I was waiting to see what was going to be their campaign call for this election. And they went for jobs. And then they couldn't scrape 10%. And so it just seems like our democracy is now becoming a single issue democracy. And so it becomes difficult for young people to then engage with that. Because if you ask young people what's the biggest issue affecting you, they're going to say jobs. And there aren't parties that are mobilizing strongly enough for a jobs conversation. And so people are then saying, okay, well, we're going to opt out.
So we're in a position at the moment where we don't know what our coalition government is going to look like at the moment. Well, not necessarily nationally. Why is it important for us to have conversations like this? What is it? What are the implications thereof? Yeah, William, if you could just speak to that.
I mean, first of all, thank you to Black Sash and Ground Up for having me here, and I think Kaya and Pearl have been really, really insightful. I think one... I'm also being sabotaged, or maybe not? Okay.
You're being insightful.
Okay, cool. I think, one reason why it's important for us to have these conversations is precisely because I think, as everyone has pointed out beforehand, that we are in uncharted territory as a country. We don't really know what the permutations of the possible trajectories of what happens tomorrow might be. But I think in having these conversations, what we also allow ourselves the ability to do is perhaps also realize the extent to which, in as much as this might feel like an inflection point for the country, we really aren't alone. So what I mean by this is South Africa is not the only place in the world that is experiencing a surge in right-wing politics. South Africa is not the only place in the world where there's a crisis of confidence in liberal democracy and its fundamental precepts. South Africa is not the only place in the world experiencing a stagnating economy and a growing gap between the rich and the poor. All of these sort of morbid symptoms that our country is experiencing define democracies around the world. And I think that one thing that it would be helpful to disabuse ourselves of as we enter into this next phase of our South African history are the ways in which we've perhaps maybe too easily believed in the triumphalism of the South African narrative, because post-94, I think everyone really bought into this idea that South Africa was this miracle democracy where, despite deep cleavages of race, class, gender, so on and so forth, we were a country that came together on the basis of goodwill to try and build a different society. And that story, I think, sustained buy-in into the post-democratic project, but that buy-in started to wane, as I think we came up against the reality of what it means to build a new country where there are so many pre-existing fault lines, and I think those fault lines have bubbled to the surface in a really stark way in this election. And I think it's not enough. I mean, a government of national unity is being touted for tomorrow, and I think that made sense in 1994 because there was a common project where people really bought into. There was a real hope and a sense of possibility. But I think 30 years into democracy, I think it's now impossible to sort of suppress some of the really existential questions that have come up. I don't mind. Yeah, clearly someone is not liking what we have to say. But I think with all of these existential questions sort of bubbling onto the surface, we're now at a point where we really have no choice as a country but to kind of wade through these difficult questions along the lines of identity, power imbalances and so on and so forth that we've perhaps preferred to relegate to the wayside. So I think conversations such as this one are a first step in doing exactly that, to sort of say that what we should not be too preoccupied with necessarily are the party political contestations that are going to unfold over the next sort of while, but to come to grips with, well, okay, what are some of the issues that, despite our discomfort with them being brought up, are necessary to have conversations about?
So just briefly, this is for all our panelists. So we've spoken briefly about a possible government of national unity, but what are the actual implications of having parties with vastly different manifestos, vastly different views of how they were actually, going around making promises to their constituents? How do we see those parties working together, basically?
Gonna listen to them and be like, I agree with them. I mean, I guess that's the question, right? So we've been speaking a lot at Youth Lab about what this means, and the thing we've said is it means constant negotiation and requires a lot of political maturity. And if I look at what our parliament looks like and has looked like, and we're asking for political maturity, so I think it's a real test for democracy, right? And it's a test for saying 30 years in, right? If you look at a 30-year-old, what you expect of them in terms of their maturity rate or their maturity, their ability to make decisions, their ability to prioritize, to work with others, that's the expectation we should have from our democracy, right? And I just don't think we have that. And so it's going to be interesting. It was especially interesting when we were talking about the possible coalition partners, and people were going, oh, well, the ANC-DA partnership is the best thing for the country because it's the best thing for the markets. And I know I'm sitting next to a chartered accountant, but I'm just going to pretend that he's not here. But it feels like the markets are also like a political party, right? And now we must all be held hostage to what these... I tweeted the other day, are the markets in the room with us? Because we're hearing all of this talk about what the markets are going to say. But a party that was instrumental in introducing minimum wage, teaming up with a party that wants to remove minimum wage, is never going to make sense. And I don't know what middle ground looks like, right? Because there's a lot of views and policy positions that parties are taking that are quite far across the spectrum from each other. And I think if we could have found a middle ground, we would have, right? If we could have found a middle ground to figure out whether or not to implement an NHI, we would have. I think our government has been a constant government of negotiation, but it's not gone particularly well for us. And so whatever this government of national unity is, I was 3 in 1994, so I don't know what that GNU looked like. I'm excited to see what GNU version 2 is going to be. But I think it's going to be a real test. And I think this election itself was a test of our democracy, right? It's the first time that the ANC dropped so far below 50. And people, Ipsos called it, and I remember when I read the Ipsos prediction, I thought these people need to get off the crack pipe because there's no way the ANC is going to get 40%. And listen, whatever fortune teller they've got there at the Ipsos office, they're right. And so we're already seeing now that our democracy has warmed up, right? And it's moved from a little brisk walk to a little bit of a jog now. And whether or not our politicians can keep up with that is really going to be the test. But I don't have that answer. It's going to be a movie. A film.
Yeah, so I think obviously the idea of constant negotiation is an accurate one. You mentioned that there's going to be a lot of deliberation in relation to every single issue. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the ANC has operated from an open corridor for 30 years. And whatever the ANC initiated in Nigeria, it kind of was going to be finally executed because it had the control of the main assembly and it had control of the National Council of Provinces. So once the ANC So what that really means, in my view, is that a lot of what has already been cast in stone is probably going to remain cast in stone. And I don't know if you keep track of the president's Twitter page, because in February, the president lost a pen. This is a big thing. Because when he lost the pen, it meant that bills that were sitting on his desk from the middle of last year simply could not be signed. And then in May, he found
all of them.
So NHI was signed into law, but the acceleration in the number of bills he's been signing since then is remarkable. His work rate has simply escalated. And of course, it's very clear why that's the case, because all of these bills were really converted into law on the basis of the ANC's open corridor. They wanted it, they have it. So now you don't want to have anything remaining in limbo and then having to figure out how to get it across the line after the new administration is put together. So even today, I think he signed 2 more, yesterday he signed 3 more. So literally the ANC is now converting everything that it tried to build over 30 years into law, so that going forward, people are going to work around the laws that it has created. Now, I personally don't think that's a bad thing, because the reality is that of all the political parties that have existed since 1994, it is the ANC that probably has the most progressive agenda. It is the ANC that has really committed itself to social protections for the poor, and those have been remarkably important. If it was the DA that had to deliberate on the question of what NSFAS should look like in its shape or form, the conversation would be very different, and that obviously there's something that resonates closely to Pearl and myself. So you imagine that we're now going to figure out how can what has already been cast in stone then be refined and be managed better, because there's no guarantee that when a minister comes and says, oh, we've decided to increase the budget for the mayoral fleet because the mayor thinks he's in danger when he drives through the city of Joburg, for example, there's no guarantee that that's going to get passed. And that's an important thing, because now people are going to have to be able to justify and explain the reasoning, not this idea that, oh, as soon as I show up, my comrades are going to back me anyway. So at some point in time, it felt that the process of consultation was really a tick box. It was superficial at best. And in some instances, it has been so superficial, the courts have had to intervene and say, this was a rubbish consultation process, you need to start again, right? So if we take from this particular alliance that emerges tomorrow and use it to create a better accountability system, and use it to create a more robust system of actually public decision making, then we would have won as a country. But of course, if that doesn't turn out to be the case, if there's bickering throughout the next 5 years and actually nothing new moves on, then we've got a new problem that, of course, the voters are going to have to own their own share of the problem. So if it turns out that what we've signed up for, which we think is going to do better, if it doesn't do better in the next 5 years, then in 2029, we've got the option of doing something completely different, and that's the benefit of this democracy. Yeah.
William, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add to what Kaya have said, which I agree with, is that the only strategy of creating a sustainable coalition arrangement or cross-party partnership, whatever form it takes, I think, is to begin an exercise of meaningful consensus building, in the sense that I think whatever iteration of government that is in power or has the majority of seats in parliament, I think political parties need to commit to a vision of social transformation in the country that does involve them putting aside their narrow party interests, if they really mean it, because that's kind of the rhetoric that's been floating around. Everyone's like saying, oh, we need to think about what this country really needs. But I think everyone approaches that question from an ideological position. And, you know, I have my own preference for what kind of ideology I want to prevail. Similarly, think that the progressive policy interventions that have been implemented or are being proposed are the way to go. But I think you kind of need to then try and crystallize a vision for the country that takes seriously the problems that afflict it, that put aside narrow interests represented by capital or whichever stakeholder it is, and says, well, how can we agree on a minimum program or a minimum manifesto for government for the next 5 years that everyone can sign onto, that even if it might kind of require a political party holding their nose to support, they recognize that this is something that is necessary to address the problems in the country. And there's obviously debate about what exactly that is, but I think these robust debates need to be encouraged. And I think that's kind of the only way to go about this, in addition to embarking on an extensive program of public consultation and being led by what the public wants rather than what is being decided from a top-down relationship here.
Thank you. I have one closing question, but I just want to go to people sitting in the room. Just to, I think we'll give about 5 questions, and then we'll do a second round. Is there anyone that has a question for our panelists?
I haven't got a question, but a comment. I think it's going to take forever. Can you hear me?
There's people online that are struggling.
I think it's going to take forever because there's so many different views. And for people to come together and decide what they're going to work towards, let alone how they're going to work towards, it's tricky.
Thanks so much for the reflections. A question that I've been grappling with, and partly because I work in civil society, so we enter into a lot of partnerships and coalitions and try to work with government and influence the agenda. And something that's been giving me sleepless nights is how does the way that we work as civil society shift and change in the current context, the new reality that we're operating in, particularly where we know that there are serious, fractures, there are things that we are trying to get over the line. But even within civil society, there are ways in which we're not working together. Maybe we're not being strategic, or we're not using tactics that can make us more influential, even in a context where we did have a center that maybe did hold, for lack of a better word. So I'm curious about your views on how civil society engages during this period and over the next couple of years. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I don't know, can we answer that and then we'll go to online if they've got any questions online?
That's one of the coolest things I've heard happen. I'm saying that's one of the coolest things I've heard happen. It just means you're cool enough for people to want to hack you.
Okay, so I think Kaya, if you want to take us on how civil society is navigating.
No, I think the first comment was, it's a very important one because there is the low-hanging fruit, there is the easy option. And the easy option is that somewhere along the line, the president and the leader of the opposition sit down and they write the baseline agenda to say, over the next 5 years, these are the key issues, these are the issues in which we're going to find consensus, and these are the issues on which we will never find consensus. And why that matters is that if there are issues on which they're going to find consensus, well, they've got 62% of the vote. So the ANC and the DA have won 62%. They've convinced 62% of citizens that they should be responsible for something in government. So if you can have that as the baseline agenda, and then the secondary agenda is to say, well, on issues of this nature, we will never ever reach consensus. So then the simple question is, well, should we even bother going through an entire process of pretending that we're trying to find a solution when we know that cumulatively we're never going to get an answer? Because then that should really inform the basis of what exactly it is that they're doing in this governance model. So if they can get to that point where they can say that when it comes to budgets, for example, these are the principles on which we're going to engage, and therefore once you guys take these dimensions, then we will support the budget, then it will actually avoid the gridlock that might emerge. Now obviously the gridlock will probably still be very prevalent in new conversations, in new issues, in new bills, in new proposals that are being put together. Because if those proposals are being put together and they're completely at odds with what their constituency or his constituency said they wanted, then you're going to find those parties either sitting out the process or simply frustrating the process altogether. So I think over the next few weeks, it's going to be quite important for us to try and figure out what are the dimensions of this arrangement that these two biggest parties are putting together. Because again, if they agree on something, we're good to go, because you can't stop them. It will be in instances where they said, look, we're not going to find common ground here. Let us reach out to other parties in order to be able to get this across the line where things might be a bit more tricky. But again, the DA will never stop. They'll never be able to prevent any bill from being passed with 22% of the vote, right? And why that's important is that ahead of the elections, there was an article well, something was written, I don't know if I should call it an article, and it said that the DA threatened to reverse affirmative action if they came into power. So I then said, well, a person who wrote that article is probably a person who doesn't actually apply their mind to try and understand how the process of lawmaking works in South Africa. So what you'll do is that if you understand how the bills go, so we've got 74, 75, 76, and 77. So there are different sections of the Constitution that then determine that if it's a bill of a particular nature, this is what needs to be done in order for you to get it across the line, right? So the very idea that any single party or a party that owns 22% of the vote could ever be in a position to essentially abolish an existing law and then create a new one is absolutely nonsensical. It's simply not going to happen. So there's also the need to contain the hysteria associated with people saying, oh dear God, they are ideologically opposed to us, so therefore it's impossible to work together. So you'll see even on Twitter, there's a lot of people that say, as soon as you mention the name, we cannot work with them because we were told that they are a historical enemy. And then you say, okay, so talk me through what exactly the dangerous dimensions are here. Do you really think that the DA is going to walk to the ANC and say, we don't like that law, abolish it overnight, and a 40% party agrees when you, it's just not going to happen. So there's a lot of hysteria out there, but of course, it's new territory, it's new anxieties, so you can't fault people for being a bit anxious about how it is, but I think sometimes some part of the hysteria, it just doesn't make sense, especially if you look at what actually happens during a public consultation and a lawmaking process. So we hope that they reach a meeting of the minds and then get things moving.
That's what happens when we have too much internet. Too much internet. I agree. I was also going to say what's going to happen is the establishment of multiple baselines, right? So if we can't agree on this, there are lots of people that can. And because the numbers are all so low, it's easy to kind of get, you're just constantly playing the numbers game, right? So we're trying to get something done, the DA is not going to agree. That's fine, because if we go to the MK and the EFF combined, they have more than the DA do, right? And there are lots of policy positions that the ANC, the MK, the EFF, the IFP, the UDM will agree on, right? So I think there are a lot of things that will take very long, but I think because politicians are also going to be under a lot of pressure to prove themselves, right? Because I don't think there's anyone who's sitting going, guys, this is going to be so great. Like, the next 5 years, everything's going to get better. We're so excited, right? Everyone's anxious. And so politicians have a lot to prove, because what voters have shown them is the few of us that do go to vote are no longer voting on the same lines that we were voting for, right? The bulk of our voting electorate is young. And if you ask them, if you go to a young person, and actually not even just a youth young person, anyone under the age of 40, and you go, oh, but Nelson Mandela, so you should vote for the ANC, they're going to look at you and say, we're not, right? So the kind of historical sentiment behind why someone would vote for the ANC, or, the big Swat Kafar, why you would vote for the DA, right? People are not tied to that sentiment anymore. One of the big things that has come out from the KZN election is people saying, well, what KZN has shown is that they can remove you, right? And if things don't work, they can remove you. And that's kind of what democracy is supposed to be, right? Is that this is not a sacred calling that you're getting from on high. This is a job. And your election is your performance review. And so ideally, we should have a democracy where if things don't work, we remove them. So to answer the civil society question, I think it's such an interesting question, because civil society is so broad, right? And you have civil actors that work with the state and work with political parties, and those that just don't. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to create more bridges with the state and its institutions, right? To sit and look across, because what we'll often find in civil society is we'll say, oh, there's this official that's in this department and they're like super progressive and we can work with them. They respond to their emails, right?
That's the definition of progress in government.
That's the definition of progress in government. You dial a phone number and someone answers. Give them a performance bonus at the end of the year, right? The bar is so low. But that's how we build alliances. We say, oh, this person is actually here to work. Great, we can work with them. And now we have an opportunity to find more of those people, right? Our parliament has never looked like this, right? What it's going to look like tomorrow. And I think we have an opportunity as civil society to build relationships based on the strength of institutions, but also demand stronger institutions, right? I think often civil society works in spite of government, right? And in spite of our leaders. And I think it allows them to kind of run away and escape accountability because we're just going to do the work anyway, right? With as little resources as we have, we're just going to carry on in our little corners. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to strengthen our institutions through that accountability, right? To look at portfolio committees, right? I often watch portfolio committees and you can see who hasn't done the reading, right? And who's in there sleeping during a meeting or even just not attending, right? We have an opportunity to, I think, build those relationships because our portfolio committees are going to be so much more diverse now that you don't need to have a contact in a party anymore, right? And actually what works better for political parties is to be the people who answers their emails, right? Because those are the ones that we're going to keep. So I think it's an opportunity for us to kind of think laterally about what our relationship with the government and with parliament is, demand better accountability, but also strengthen our own relationships with each other within civil society, right? We don't find each other, right? I hate the term drink every time someone says we work in silos. But we really do, right? It's so hard for us to find each other because you have more resources than I do, but we're also all competing for the same resources. There isn't a lot of funding available. There's just so many hurdles that we have to get over. But when it comes to elections, civil society holds up voter education. Civil society holds up election observation missions, right? We are the engine that drives this democracy forward. And I think we have to figure out how to strengthen our own relationships with each other and kind of create that kind of power, I guess, to then build better relationships with our institutions, but also demand better from them, right? I think it's so easy for us to kind of get caught up and write off institutions, right? Oh, we can't work with this institution because it's just full of comrades, right? I think it's a good opportunity to kind of try to change that narrative and also think about what does accountability really mean, right? And I think that's a question that young people across the board are asking is, well, now we voted and everyone tells us that democracy is not just voting and we have to hold people accountable, but what does that actually mean? And I think we have a role as civil society to figure out what that accountability looks like in practice and then actually exercise it and then hopefully vote people out if they don't do their work.
So we have to wait 5 years to vote them out.
No, you can do it in 2 years' time.
You can do it in 2 years. Local elections are now.
Killing them here. And then by the time they get to 2029, they'll know.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I'll add to that, which I think was great, is that the strange upshot of being in this unprecedented conjuncture, I think, is that even though we saw the lowest voter turnout since 1994, I think we're starting to see a lot of people's interests in the political process being piqued again just because it's new. And I think this is as an opportunity, on the one hand, to put politicians under more scrutiny. I think Paul is absolutely right, and Kai is absolutely right, that the fact that there are more eyeballs paying attention to the political process might have an effect on how politicians behave. And I think that on the flip side also gives civil society this opportunity to come together on a range of different issues, but I think a key one is sort of trying to rebuild the capacity of citizens again, because I think precisely because it's so new, it's so uncharted, it's so different, I think there's going to be a lot of confusion, as there was leading up to the election, about how things are going to work, about how things might unfold going forward. And I think there's in the climate of disinformation that is sort of thriving online as well, I think trying to capacitate citizens themselves to sort of have all the tools that they need to understand how the political process works, which civil society has been doing for the last 30 years, but I think is really a priority now, precisely because there are going to be so many different moving parts, and trying to stay solid when the ground all around you is sort of sinking and floating and changing, I think is going to be really important over the next period.
So I'm going to take another round of questions from, I think you can hear me, I'm going to take another round of questions from the audience. But just before we do that, I just want our panel to give a thought of, so we voted. We're in the eve of the first sitting of, I've still got my Koki, yes. So we're at the eve of the first sitting of the 7th Parliament. What now? So I'm just going to give another round of questions. Okay, I think we can go. Do we? Oh, no, please do. Do I need a mic? It's for the online. I think it's not for. Sorry. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, given the differing views, particularly, what do you think the implications, if any, there will be on the stance and approach to Palestine? Because I know we had the ICJ case that was brought by South Africa and other countries are joining in. But do you think there will be any change in the approach of, or at least the response by South Africa to what's happening in Palestine?
I'd just like to add to that because it's not irrelevant, it is the same issue. The Ukraine thing was also like unprecedented, well, I don't know what, unsomething. It's not what we would necessarily have expected. So perhaps the people, I can understand that people here, Palestine issue is crucial, but although Ukraine is so much further from us in all sorts of ways as well as geographic, the decisions that have been made on our behalf, in a sense, about Ukraine are also relevant, and I wouldn't mind hearing about that too.
Is there a third question just before we go back to the panel?
Statistics for South Africa on Google, so I don't buy accuracy, but 7.3% of the population according to Google. So that, and maybe they are a higher percentage of those people that have voted, but then many of us don't vote DA. So I think there's more to the 20%, and that one must just be a little more nuanced about might be seen by some as an effective government experience or reasonably or better or whatever in the Western Cape. And I know that can be contentious, and I know it might not be the same for everybody. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I think in my circle of people, and they're not all white, there has been an acknowledgement of things working. Now, whether that translates into a vote, I don't know. But it looks to me like not all 20% of people could have been white.
One more question, or then we can go. Start this next question.
Oh, yeah, sure. Which one to respond to first? It's on Palestine. I think I mirror what Kaya said earlier in the sense that I think simply because the ANC commands the largest vote share in Parliament, and it's been at the forefront of South Africa's diplomatic attempts to hold Israel accountable. I don't see that changing. I think that the ANC has also, over the last maybe 2 years, been crafting a role on the international arena, becoming the sort of normative leader, at least among countries of the global south, challenging the sort of Western-led international order, and I think that's going to remain a policy priority for it. So I don't foresee its stance changing like anytime soon. I think the only kind of thing that might shift the way the ANC approaches Palestine is if there are sort of further geopolitical, economic repercussions from the people with international power, you know, the United States and the West. But I don't see that changing, and I think that would be a good thing. And I think, Ukraine is contentious for precisely that reason, in the sense that I think the ANC, for all of our domestic problems with them, I think the ANC does represent a genuine feeling amongst countries of the global south that the war in the Ukraine, for all the ways in which we might think, Russia unjustly invaded and call that out and want to hold them accountable, that sort of the West has mobilized, has mobilized and kind of effectively created a proxy Cold War situation in Ukraine, and just doesn't have any interest in that. Most countries in the global south have no interest in that. I disagree with the ANC's position on Ukraine, but I'm not surprised by it, because I think there's a common feeling among the global south of resenting this idea of being lectured by the West and told to kind of fall in line in support of the West's efforts to contain Russia and, by extension, China. So I don't see the ANC's foreign policy changing anytime soon. And I will maybe answer that for now. Should I?
No, I think
Yeah, let's give out the
So Kai and I did a quick Google on the Palestine question. 18 parties that are in parliament, 7 of them have either been vocally pro-Israel or funded by pro-Israel funders, and they make up less than 30% of the vote. So good luck to them. But I don't think our ICJ case is going anywhere. And I think just our historical tie with Palestine is enough to solidify going anywhere in that fight. Is airtight. The question about good governance, right? So if we're talking about it, and I'm going to. Okay, there's no other. Great. I'm going to. Depends how many Durban songs you can do. How do you feel about bunny chows? So the Indian population largely voted for the DA, right? Embarrassingly so. Especially in Phoenix, right? So in Phoenix, it was something like 86% of the vote went to the DA, right? I'm from Durban. My dad's family are from Phoenix, so I visit Phoenix often. There is not a single point in that community where you can say, this is working. Let's keep these people in, right? People are not voting based on good governance, right? And I often say, because if you look at Phoenix and Chatsworth, right, which is the factory shop for my people, it is since the floods, right, in KZN, there are roads that are still closed off because they haven't been fixed. There are entire areas that still don't have water or electricity. People have not received aid, right? My aunt lost her house during the floods, and there's still, the area has not even been cleaned out. So there's no even possibility of them salvaging anything from that wreckage, right? And yet the majority of Chatsworth voted for the DA. And the DA has been running Chatsworth for as long as I can remember, right? So people are not necessarily, I was laughing at this during this election because I was like, my people are so committed to racism that they would rather live in squalor than just vote differently, right? That you'd rather point to an invisible black danger and say, I don't want that, than to look at what's actually happening in your house. And the fact that parties like the DA, the ACDP, use you as voting cattle, right? There's no services, and they drum up prejudice, right? So I remember in the last election, the DA had this big election campaign about how the ANC is going to amend the affirmative action laws and exclude Indian people from it. And so they did this whole, first you weren't white enough, then you weren't black, they love that line. And I was like, so nobody in Durban picked up the internet and just read, because there wasn't even such a bill being debated, right? But it's so easy to stoke that kind of bigotry and the weird like social fractions that we have. And because you have a voting electorate that's not getting informed and is also not cohesive, right? So Durban, I think, is such an interesting city because, you know, we come to Cape Town and we're like, apartheid, hectic in this place, right? But actually, Durban is where they got apartheid right? Where even now, we know that there are beaches that Indian people go to, and there are beaches that white people go to, and there are beaches that black people go to, and never the three shall meet, right? There are malls that you know, no, that's our mall. And how do you know that? There's a spice shop there, right? But there are parks. There, like, every single space that citizens access, there's an intrinsic idea that you know this is where your people go to, right? And those divisions are nowhere close to being healed, right? And it's really funny because like everybody in Durban speaks Zulu. So it's like they're all racisming each other in Zulu. Like it's a really weird kind of phenomenon, right? But the point is that if people were voting based on good governance, I think our election results would look so much more different than they currently do. But even the idea of good governance and who it serves, right? Because if things only work well for a few people, they're not working well, right? If I can access a good school, but the bulk of the population can't, it doesn't mean things are working well. It just means I'm rich, right? And that's how inequality works in South Africa, is that if you are somewhere close to the middle class, which often means you're just one, then you live, I call it the discovery life, because, you know, you get your discovery medical aid, you got your vitality, you get to go to Virgin Active, you get your free Kauai smoothies, but across the street from you, people don't have water. So things aren't working, right? What we've just done is privatized governance and made it accessible to people who can afford it and to people who are going to see it, right? And Cape Town is a great example of that, because if you shut your eyes when you're driving from the airport, you go, oh my gosh, this is such a great city, right? But you have to shut your eyes when you're driving from the airport. And then you get to Camps Bay and you're in Europe. And so I think that's what good governance means, because if you don't have a governance that serves at least the majority, are you going to throw your shoe at me? Great. If you don't have a governance that serves the majority, or at the very least has equal access, then things are not working. And I just don't think people are voting based on whether they're working or not.
Oh, yours is working. One short comment. I think the foreign policy orientation is probably, apparently it's not working. Oh, okay. I think the country's foreign policy orientation is probably cast in stone now. It's unlikely to change because obviously for us to, and remember there's a fluidity around foreign policy. It's not like there's a document that says that whenever there's a conflict involving X and Y, we will do this. It's always been a matter of in relation to what the nature of the conflict is and what the issues are, what does the country's position become. And I think obviously one of the great tragedies of what's going to happen tomorrow is that our chief diplomat, somebody who's managed to navigate these waters much better than I think any other person would have done. She's not coming back to Parliament because she didn't make it to the list because of you people not elevating her high enough. So I think that is probably the one drawback, in that we're going to have to find a diplomat who is as diplomatic as she was, because I think let's lobby for her to come back then. Yeah, so yeah, I can take two people from the outside. So I do think that we probably are going to see a continuation of that. And obviously when new conflicts emerge, then there will be much more difficult conversations about what official position the country must take. Up until now, it's been a matter of what is the ANC's historical position. We know their principal stance on the Palestine question, and we also know their ideological leanings towards, the Soviet empire of old. So that obviously influenced a big part of the Ukraine response. Now, obviously, if new conflicts emerge, I think they will have to get enough heads around the room to formulate a national response rather than a party response being the response. And that has been the case for the past 30 years.
Kaya, sorry, since you have the mic, I want you to just take us into the conversation around.
Thank you. I want to just take us into the conversation around, so what happens now?
Yeah.
What do our SOEs look like? What does custody look like?
will it be determined by who the minister will be? And yeah, so if you could just take us through what.
It's remarkably difficult, and what makes it difficult is that I empathize with the parties that will try to govern with the ANC, because they come in at a point in time where the ANC's custody or custodianship of public finances has been so remarkably poor. Everybody's walking in on a very, very difficult fiscal tightrope, right? So that simply means that whoever signs up to be in government with the ANC is unfortunately going to have to figure out how to make things work in light of serious limitations in resources. And that's a problem that obviously this was the way to do things, and therefore, if it hasn't worked out, well, here we are, you've decided you're in government with us, so let's make it work. But what we're hoping we are able to see is the initiation of the more difficult conversations that the ANC has been avoiding for a very long time. So the ANC's solution to Pearl saying we don't have enough money is to say, let's borrow more money. It's never been, okay, tell us what happened to the resources that we had and what we need to do in order to generate new resources in order to fulfill that particular mandate. So if you look at the borrowing patterns, that's been their answer to say, oh, the unions want more money. You said that you're not going to vote for us if we don't give you more money, therefore let's just give them more money. So there's never been an honest conversation about the fact that, well, if it turns out that the sum of the demands is XYZ and the resources are XYZ, what do we need to do in order to build new resources? Because there's always going to be a machinist that's going to give you money, but that's not the answer to the problem. So that's why we now see the consequence of that. Now the reality is that the ANC's model has resulted in the inevitable crowding out effect. So when you talk about the crowding out effect, Michael Sachs has a very good term for how he explains this. He says that there is something that you refer to as constitutionally mandated spending. So when you mention SASSA, that's constitutionally mandated spending because social protection is part of our constitution. Healthcare and education, that's constitutionally mandated spending. So when you end up with the graph that indicates that the debt service costs are now higher than the constitutionally mandated spending, we've got a problem. Because the simple answer is that no, in the Constitution does it say that you must pay interest, because it is interest that you're going to have to borrow money. So that crowding out effect simply means that the government has actually been involved in a very deep austerity program that they simply did not declare. So how you see this austerity program is you listen to NESFA's presenting to the Portfolio Committee on Higher Education. They say, Treasury has told us that our budget is XYZ, so therefore 58,000 students will not be funded next year, and then the year after 80,000 students will not be funded, right? So what that does is that it simply says that do not onboard new people onto the system, just stick to what you have, and obviously if people transition out, then that's what you must do. So the reason that model has worked well is that if I've never been on NSFAS, then it's not a denial of access. Denial of access has got far more acute implications than simply being prevented from accessing it. So if I'm funded this year and I'm not funded next year, there's a problem. I'm going to go and call Pearl and we'll do fees must fall again. But if I've never ever been funded, then it's kind of difficult for me to mobilize at the same level. So we now know that that's what they've been doing for a very long time. It's the same thing with the directives that they keep issuing to departments to say that do not increase your payroll. If somebody leaves, well, don't replace them, you know, that type of thing. So it's a matter of this austerity program has been going on. So parties that sign up to work with the ANC are going to have to figure out the difficult question of how exactly do you reverse that trend, because it is unsustainable. You cannot have the unconstitutionally mandated spending crowding out the constitutionally mandated spending, because eventually it's going to create the social unrest that you saw, particularly in 2021. So I think those are the big challenges that everyone else is going to have to face. There might be the easy wins to say, well, if you're spending so much on all these deputy ministers and nobody really knows what they do, well, just keep them with the parliamentary salary. Don't double it by calling them a deputy minister. That might be easy, so maybe they'll try that.
Or remove them altogether.
Huh?
Oh, what now? The austerity question is really if painful, because in my other life, I work at the NYDA. Please don't fight me. My term is ending in December. But we had to, it's a tough job, hey? I used to drag them on Twitter, and then I got onto that board, and listen. But we had to send back 30 million rand at the end of last year. We got an in-year budget cut. And we run government's biggest voucher, like grant program for small businesses. We run the biggest program for like startup funding from government, and we had to give back 30 million rand. And it was, I'm not even gonna tell you what our budget was cut by this year. And it's interesting, the vacancy thing, right? Because they tell you that you can't hire more people, and then when you the biggest things they vacancy rate. And we were like, well. But what now? I agree with William, right? That people are engaged in a way that I don't think we've seen before, right? And by and large, social media is to blame and to credit for it. But there's so much more appetite now because when things are new, they're exciting, right? People, and you didn't have to know about the 3 ballots for you to be excited about it afterwards, right? The number of people who have been talking about the GNU, right? People I've never heard talk about are now like, even if you're asking the question of what is this, right? We have an appetite. There's been, at Youth Lab, we've got such a growing number of people going, I really want to stay involved because we can't come to 2029 and then at that point go, oh, we need to do voter education. Oh, how do we get more people to vote, right? Democracy is an everyday event. And so I think what now is to remember that democracy is an everyday event, right? And engage with this democracy every day, right? We do have a really good participatory process through parliament, right? Not many countries in the world get to claim that we have a constitutional imperative to do public consultations, right? But big bills that come through, you get 100 submissions to parliament, 200 submissions to parliament. They're all up there on the website. You can go see them, right? We have to participate. We have to, right? We have to learn. We've been doing a lot of work to say every parliamentarian gets assigned a constituency. So where you live, you will have an MP responsible for your area. Do you know who your MP is? No, right? Most of us don't. And their phone numbers and their email addresses are up on the parliament website. Nag them, right? You pay them. And so when you complain about how much money SARS is taking from you, this is at least a nice way to get vengeance on the people that it's been given to, right? We have to find ways to stay engaged, but meaningful ways to stay engaged, right? And meaningful ways isn't complaining on social media about the pothole in your street. It's about learning about what a ward committee is and getting involved, right? Local elections happen in 2 years. And I love national elections because I like disassociate from it and pretend I don't live in this country. And I'm just like, wow, this is so interesting. Wonder what's gonna happen to those people. And then, you know, it's me too. But local elections is the oxygen of our democracy, right? It is the things that happen in our communities every single day. And we don't engage with that, right? It's the only system where we're kind of directly electing people even, right? And so we need to be really plugged in for what local elections, because the way local elections and national elections mirror each other or don't is important for how our communities are run. And so I think for me, what now is that it's our turn, right? We sit during the 5 years out of elections and we say, gosh, we don't have enough options to vote for. And then we get 100 pounds. It's too much. These ballots are so long, right? And we went, oh, it's so long. So you have options, right? And then we go, oh, but none of these politicians are good enough. But in the 5 years, we are the people, we got the government that we deserve, right? Because we went and voted or we didn't vote. And so the next 5 years, it's now our turn to say, what kind of citizens do we want to be so that we can model the kind of country that we want, right? We have a beautiful democracy, we have a beautiful constitution that actually does give citizens power. We're not a powerless nation, right? We get to stand up and call our president cupcake to his face and live to tell the tale the next day. And so I think and really plug in as citizens, right? Because it is our country. We love this place. There's no place like this one. And I think we owe it to ourselves to be more engaged over and above this. Find civil society organizations, parliamentarians, watch parliament, start democracy.
I don't have much to add to that, to be honest. I mean, what I will say is that the kind of cliched phrase that I've understood this election through is what the old Italian communist Antonio Gramsci once said, which is that the old is dying and the new is struggling to be born. And to me, I think that's a story of this election, because even though the ANC lost the majority by almost 20%, if you look at the parties, the beneficiaries of that, they're effectively factions of the ANC, right? And the story of the 15 years of South African democracy has been the decomposition of the ANC, and it's produced the two most exciting entrants. Well, exciting in the sense of the most kind of surprising entrance into the political scene, the economic freedom fighters and the MK party. So the decomposition of the ANC has been the deciding force in South African politics. And if you add the cumulative vote share of the ANC, the EFF, and the MK party, then the majority of the electorate is still kind of voting for national liberation politics. I think the old is definitely dying, but we haven't really seen kind of a new political alternative emerge that captures the popular imagination. I think what this election has revealed are what are some of the things that might do that, what direction is our politics trending towards. But I think what it has done is it's inaugurated a new phase where, kind of the old is dying, but it remains to be seen what replaces that. And I think Paul is absolutely spot on that the next 5 years is going to be this period where we see what citizens get up to, whether a political alternative might be produced, whether it might not, whether the kind of ascendancy of the political forces right now might continue, whether they might kind of collapse. So I really don't know, to be honest, what now is, to answer your question. I don't know what happens now, other than what Kaya and Pearl have said. But I do think we're in a very kind of, as everyone has belabored, we're in this exciting phase of South African history where we really don't know where things are going to go. But I think that's a sign in itself, in a sense, of our democracy maturing, right? Where the old fault lines don't really hold water anymore. They have some latent power, but they're not really kind of appealing to people in the ways that they might once have, because the largest voting bloc in this election is the constituency of people who either registered to vote and didn't, or didn't register to vote at all. And I think the question is kind of, well, what are they going to be up to in the next 5 years? What are they going to key into in the next 5 years? What are they going to care about in the next 5 years? And even before the next 5 years, heading into the local government elections.
Thank you. So just to end off, I just want to thank our panelists, and I think it was a perfect way to end off, William. Thank you. So I don't know about anyone else in the room. I know I'm going to be getting to bed very early tonight. I went to fetch our accreditation for, I don't know if everybody knows that our first sitting tomorrow will be happening at the CTICC. We are preparing for a slightly chaotic morning because there are about 400 journalists that will be attending. Everybody wants to know who is going to be walking up there, taking their oath. Who are going to be the people elected as speaker? Who will be representing us for the next 5 years, and how will they work together? So in anticipation for tomorrow, I know I'm excited. A lot of people are nervous. I hope that you will all be joining us tomorrow, whether that be on social media, on TV, but we've got a lot of work to do in all the spaces that we work. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. I know Amanda will do a proper closing. I don't know why I'm closing for her, but sorry. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we hope to have more engagements like this.
Thank you so much to our great panelists. They called the last ANC conference the Envelopes Conference, so there are envelopes for you also. But you must declare this with your organizations. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who came. I know that someone RSVP'd with an email that says, only if it doesn't rain. I don't know who that was, but thank you for coming, because it didn't rain. But thank you all for coming. Normally, I would present you with donation cards to donate to the Black Sash, but I'm going to leave you with our website link if you do want to donate to the work of the Black Sash, so we can carry on having these important conversations. There are also some books on sale and also some free materials. If anybody wants a copy of the Constitution, you can have one outside. So yeah, thank you to my colleagues for helping Koliwe run around during the hacking. The hacking was terrible, guys. And Lindsay also for hanging. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to all of you for showing up. Am I missing anyone, Gail, for thanking? Oh, yes. Yes, so I do want to say that this is, this is our, we have been evicted. Is the nature of living in Cape Town in the Western Cape is that my people are always moved. We are, but we're moving to Imanaroon Street, which actually, if you know, Imanaroon Street was a site of eviction. So the Black Sash, so next Khuluma that we will have in a few months' time, which we will send you an invitation to, will be in Imanaroon Street in Claremont. There's 3 Woolworths in a 5-kilometer radius, so I'm excited. So yeah, we are moving to a nearby Woolies, but this is our last day in this building with all these wonderful art pieces. I think most people know that's Aninka Klaasen. So yeah, please, there's also please eat soup. Please eat the food. Thank you, everybody. Eat the food, please. Thank you. Bye.